All right, well, it is 4 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. I realize that I am the last thing that stands between you and the movie here in a little bit, so I'm going to try my best to get through this content. We've got a little bit of ground to cover today, but we're going to try and get through it here as quick as we can. So you'll see on the screen here, I've got a QR code for you to scan. I'm also going to show it at the end of the presentation, but that will take you to my webpage that has the outline of this talk on it, and there's a link on there for GitHub. If you go to that GitHub guide, I'm going to reference several different resources throughout this presentation, and I've got links out to all of those resources in a nice, convenient place for you to look at them there. So I'll show this again at the end, but if you want to grab that, you'll have another opportunity here in a second. So by show of hands, how many here you have an idea or you think you want to publish a mobile app, but you've never done so? You've never tried publishing an app before, but you think you want to try. All right, that's a fair amount of people. So this is the talk for you. This is to help familiarize you with the process of publishing a mobile app, what the scenery is right now, what the state of things are, and how to get through that. So just as a way of introduction, just a couple little bullet points about me. That's what I look like if you're not sure what I look like there. So I won't belabor this slide too much, but my name's Ryan Carroll. I'm an engineer at Cover My Meds at the moment, and I enjoy a few different things. So we're going to go through several different topics here today through this talk. So just a little outline of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the state of mobile app development in general and some of the different paths that you can go right now. And then obviously we're going to dive into React Native and what React Native is, some of the fundamentals and what it brings to the table. We're going to talk about Expo a little bit as well. And then I'm going to dive into a little bit of the process in general beyond the technology of how you go from idea to development to production with a mobile app and what that looks like and some of the different things that you're going to have to go through throughout that process. And then at the end, hopefully if there's time, I'm going to touch on burnout just a little bit because I think that's important when you start to take on these kinds of projects that are a little bit bigger, especially if it's a side project on your own time. Burnout can be quite a bit of a factor there. So I'm going to hopefully touch on that at the end. Before we get into the technology piece, though, I want to mention a word at first here about what is your idea. And React Native is a tool in the toolbox. All of these technologies that we use every day are tools to help us bring ideas and solutions to life that will help people and make the world a better place. So as we go through this talk, one thing that I want you to be thinking about is what is your idea? What do you have that you want to bring to life and show the world? And what is going to set that idea apart? So the technology is fun. We're going to talk about that. But really, the idea is what shines. You use the technology as a tool to bring that idea to life. So keep that in mind as we go through this. A couple numbers here, the state of mobile app development in general. It's a big opportunity. There's a lot of market for it. If you think about it, pretty much everybody has a device. Most people have more than one device, so there's more devices in the world than there are people. So it's a big market. There's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of dollars that are being spent on these app store markets through purchases and subscriptions and all of these different things. So why might you want to develop a mobile app, and what does that bring? There's a lot of opportunity represented there. And with all that, you need to think about how is your idea going to stand out? There are tons and tons and tons of apps that are put on the marketplace every single day. When you're thinking about what you're going to bring to the table, you need to think about what's going to differentiate your idea amongst all the existing ideas that are out there, or your product, or whatever it is that you're bringing. How are you going to stand out from the crowd and stand out from the rest? So just a question to think about as we go through this. So when it comes to mobile app development, there's generally speaking 3 different approaches that you can take to this. The first one is the native approach, and this is if you're building in iOS, you're going to be using Xcode and Swift and these different tools. If you're building for Android, it's going to be Android Studio and Kotlin most likely, and these different things. The point here about native app development is it's going to give you the best performance because you're building natively for that particular system, but it's going to be double the effort because you have 2 different code bases that you're going to have to maintain if you're going to go to both platforms. Another approach that you might take, this is a little bit more of a dated approach at this point, but it's known as the hybrid approach. And at a high level, it's kind of like building a web view and then packaging that into a mobile app and shipping it that way. And it's generally going to have slower performance, but it will be the least amount of effort because you're developing it once and shipping it to all platforms. What we're going to be talking about today, however, is what is known as cross-platform, and this is where React Native falls. React Native falls under cross-platform native development. And it's going to give you near native performance. It's going to be really, really close. Not quite there for a couple different reasons that we don't quite have time to get into today, but it's going to give you efficient development and a native UX experience. And what I mean by a native UX experience is if you are writing a button and rendering a button, it's going to render like a button does in the system that it is presented on. So you code a button once, and when that button is displayed on iOS, it looks like an iOS button. If it's displayed on an Android system, it's going to look like a material design Android button, unless you specifically style it otherwise, which is a neat feature of cross-platform that you don't really get with hybrid, because I mentioned hybrid as a web view. You code that button and it looks the same everywhere, no matter what platform you're on. So when you're going to develop a mobile app, these are the 3 different general approaches that you can take and some advantages and disadvantages to each one. So again, we're going to dive more into the cross-platform approach today. So when you're looking at cross-platform, you're generally going to be choosing between these 2 options. We've got React Native and we have Flutter. So React Native is open source. It's backed by Meta and it has a ton of community support. There's a lot of good that comes along with React Native, but I do want to recognize that Flutter is also a player in this field, and it is Google's offering. It uses the Dart programming language, and fundamentally, these platforms are architected very differently from each other. I don't quite have time to get into all of the underlying differences between them, but at a very, very basic level, Flutter code or Dart code compiles down into native code, and React Native kind of hooks like fingers into already compiled native components. So I won't get too deep into that today, but that's a high-level difference between the 2. React Native has really, really, really good community support, which is one of the big reasons that I chose to use it. When you're going to be embarking on a side project in particular, you want to choose something that is very well supported in the community so that when you run into problems and you find errors and you're having trouble figuring out what those errors mean, generally when something's well supported and you go to Google these different things, you'll find lots of people that have run into the same thing. Whereas if it's a project that has less support, it's going to be harder to find answers to those questions. So just different things like that that you'll want to be thinking about when you choose a platform. A fun fact is the Xbox UI is actually written in React Native. So React Native has a lot of support from various places and people and companies, and Microsoft is kind of getting in on the bandwagon with it too and adding some features to it. So just some different reasons why you might consider using React Native there. So what are some fundamentals of React Native? What does it bring to the table for us? And what you get out of the box is you get routing, which is going to be how you navigate from screen to screen and how you kind of stitch all your pages together. It's going to give you those fundamental building block components that you're going to need to use, like buttons and screens and text boxes and these different things. It gives you a common language and design patterns to develop in, and we're going to take a look at what the code looks like in just a moment. But it's primarily TypeScript, so if you're a web developer, and in particular if you've used React on the web, React Native is going to be pretty familiar to you in the different hooks and things of that nature that it uses in these design patterns. So from a web developer standpoint, it's a very approachable system. Sometimes I think that getting into mobile app development can seem intimidating because it's this new system. It's kind of seems a little bit out of reach and a little further out there. But with React Native, it really brings that approachability in from a web developer perspective. I already mentioned that it has vibrant community support, and then we just talked about the approachable learning curve from the web. So we'll keep on moving. So if you've done web code, you've done HTML, CSS, that type of thing, then this should look very familiar to you. You've got a view that's displaying some text, right? We've got a div tag, an h1 tag, we've got a button on there with a click handler, pretty standard stuff. So what does that look like in React Native? It's going to look very similar, just slightly different. So React Native brings those components into play that it offers. So here's the same thing on the right side, but written in React Native instead. So you're using a view component instead of a div, and you're using a text component instead of a paragraph or an h1 or however you want to display your text. And then instead of a button, I'm using a touchable opacity, and that click handler is now an on-press handler. But it's very, very, very similar to what you would see on the website. It's just using slightly different components and slightly different properties on those components that you send to them, but very familiar code. On the styling side, if you've used CSS much at all, this should also look familiar to you. You've got a basic container class. We are setting the display, trying to center some content, which is, like, for some reason, the hardest thing to do anytime you're trying to do it, and you always have to Google how to do it again. But just some basic things that we're setting. And what React Native brings in is it brings in a style sheet abstraction, and you set all of your styles using their style sheet layer that they have. So your CSS code is very, very similar. You just write it ever so slightly differently. So with CSS, you might use the hyphens in between things, and now you're using camel casing instead, and you're defining all of your styles inside of this style sheet object. So very approachable, very easy learning curve, very easy translation from a web HTML type of context into these different components that you're using. So when you're displaying some of these on the screen, hopefully it's not too small there, but here is what text looks like, and I'm rendering these on iOS. So this is what the iOS version is going to look like. Android would look slightly differently, but this is just a small piece of text. Here is a button on iOS, and you'll notice it looks like an iOS button, which doesn't have an outline. It's just some highlighted text, but if I were to render this on Android, it would have the whole outline and everything like it would in Material Design. There's a text box at the top. I'm not going to linger on these too much, but you kind of get the idea from here. It's using that text input component, and it's got a few different properties and handlers that's going into it there. So we've talked about React Native and what React Native brings. And now I want to transition and mention Expo for a moment. So if you're not familiar, React Native is a framework for building native mobile apps. And Expo is like another framework on top of React Native. And if you go to the React Native documentation, it's actually the recommended approach for starting and building in React Native. And the way that I like to think about it is React Native simplifies the coding experience, and Expo simplifies all of the processes that are around building a mobile app. And you'll see what I mean as we talk through this, but that's really the differentiating factor between the two systems. So I think that it helps to understand what Expo is by understanding what you're having to deal with without using Expo. So without using Expo, your local development and build environment is going to be very complicated and complex to set up. Your build process and getting it to the App Store is going to require a lot of complicated configuration, and it's going to be a lengthy and a tedious process. So without Expo, your build process might look something like this. You have a separate iOS build and you have a separate Android build, and you have to use the custom tools for each and get all of this configuration together and go through all of these tedious steps to get to the end product to build your app package at the end of the pipeline. But with Expo, it's really just a streamlined process all the way through, where they give you CLI tools that will help build these packages for you without you having to mess with the native tools and configuring all of these different things yourself. And it saves a pretty significant amount of time. I'd say to set up a build for each system is probably going to take you at least a half hour or so. But with an Expo, it's going to help you get it done in minutes. So we've already mentioned it, but Expo gives you streamlined local setup. It gives you automated builds. And we're going to walk through these steps in a little bit more depth in a moment and see what they actually look like. It also gives you simplified local device testing. So Expo has a CLI that they give you, and you run that CLI in your project directory, and it will come up with a QR code that you can scan. And I can't really do it here because of the internet situation, but if you scan the QR code on your phone, your app that you're developing will actually be side-loaded onto your device, and it will display on your real device as you're developing it. And it also supports hot refresh. So if I change some text or whatever on my project and I save it, that's going to instantly be reflected on my device. And then if you have different emulators and things installed on your laptop, you can have it to run inside of the emulators as well. So if you have, say, an iOS emulator, you don't want to use a real device, you can have your app launch through that emulator using these CLI tools. And it's a really simple command to just run it, and it will open in the emulator for you. It also guides you through the app submission process. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive on that in a minute. And I will say that it's free with an asterisk. They have different plans for how many builds you want to submit, and if you're running those builds on their servers versus your local machine, you get unlimited builds on your local machine. If you want to submit builds to their server, you get like a certain bucket of builds per month that you can use. I've never really had any problems with the free plan. I've never put in my credit card information or anything for them. So take that with what you will. And then there's also an open source arm for Expo that they've added extra functionality on top of React Native as well, which we're going to look at here in a second. So I've talked about the CLI, I've talked about the fast refresh when you're saving your changes and you can see them instantly on your device. Expo also has these extra packages that give you access into specific APIs on the device itself that React Native doesn't necessarily give you. We're going to look at some code snippets for that in a second, but think things like haptic feedback, playing audio, using different components of the physical device like that. And then they offer end-to-end testing libraries that you can use to write testing for your apps as well. So I mentioned the API access. So say that you want to trigger the device to vibrate when something happens. Expo offers libraries to make these things very simple and easy to use and easy to configure. So here I've got a snippet of code, and you can see on line 1, I'm importing haptics from Expo Haptics. And then on line 5, I'm initiating a vibration to the device. So all I had to do was install that library to my project, import it, and use it. Very, very simple and easy to do. And that's functionality that comes from Expo that isn't built into React Native. Another example here is playing audio. So I'm doing something very similar, importing Expo AV on line 1. And then on line 6, I am initiating that audio to play. Very, very simple and easy to do. All right, we've talked about React Native. We looked at the code a little bit. We have talked about Expo and what it brings to the table. We're going to touch more on that when we get to the development section of this and look at those CLI tools at a little bit of a deeper level. But I want to step back for a second and talk about how do you go from idea to development and then ultimately to production. So this is kind of like that software development lifecycle that we're used to, how I think about it. So it usually starts out where you get a really fun idea and you get passionate about this idea and you want to bring it to life. Your next step is typically going to be to storyboard that idea somehow. We're going to dive into what that means more in a moment. And there's a number of things that you want to plan ahead for and think about in terms of building a mobile application that maybe you're not used to thinking about in other contexts. Then there's the development phase, actually getting through the nuts and the bolts of programming, hands-on keyboard, that kind of thing. Then there's the publishing process, which we're going to get into, and all of the hurdles that you might face there. And then that's it. So when you're planning ahead, there are a few things that you want to think about. The first one is going to be a roadmap. So when you really think about it, a mobile app is a product in itself. And you want to think about, how am I going to roadmap this out and what sort of features might I want for the future? You don't want to get into a situation where you develop yourself into a corner where you can't really add features later on because you've kind of closed off yourself to extending this product further. So you want to be thinking ahead a little bit of, I'm going to put a little bit out first, but I have all of these other things that I can add to it later on so that it can live and breathe and have its own life in the future, just like you would any other product. You also want to think about if you're going to monetize it at some point. We're going to see here in a few slides that putting these applications out there isn't free. It's not terribly expensive, but it does cost a little bit of money. So you need to decide, am I doing this purely from a passion project point of view and I'm willing to self-fund it and I don't plan on making any money off of it? Or do I want to have a plan at some point to put some kind of monetization strategy into it? And there's all kinds of different strategies that you can get into, but you want to be thinking about that ahead of time as you're planning out what this idea is going to look like when you bring it to life and bring it to the store, so that you're not trying to cram something in after you've put it out there and it doesn't really fit. Another thing that you want to think about is analytics. So what you don't want to do is put an app out there, have no analytics in it, and then decide later on, oh, I wonder how people are using it. I wonder what they're clicking on. I wonder what pages they're using. I wonder what features they're having trouble with. Maybe analytics isn't important to you, and it's okay to leave that out. But if you are going to want those things, you want to put them in at the beginning. That way you don't put an app in the store and then realize, oh, I want this data, but now you have all of that usage data that you can't get back because it didn't have analytics when you launched it. So just a couple simple items to be thinking through as you're planning ahead. Now when you get into the develop phase, this is the CLI that I kept referencing earlier. So Expo has Really, really good CLI tooling that will help bootstrap your project very quickly. It is a quick, easy npx command to get a hello world application running that has all of the basic structure that you're going to need to start developing your own components and getting your product to life. I will also mention that Expo has excellent documentation that will walk you through exactly what you need to know to get started with building in React Native. So instead of repeating all of the good documentation that they have, I'm just going to point you to this CLI command and their getting started documentation, which again is really good at taking your hand, especially if you're new to this, and guiding you step by step through that process. And I'm going to have this link in the guide as well, but I can't stress enough how helpful this was to get started. And that's all I'm going to mention about developing for now, because I really do think that the publishing portion can be the most intimidating part of this process. We're all technically minded people. Following tutorials and guides and these different things is generally not that bad, but the bureaucratic publishing type of process can be the more intimidating thing that I think is less talked about. So let's jump into that. After you get your app built, how do you actually get it out there so people can download it? And we're going to start with some prerequisites. And there's a number of accounts that you're going to need to get started with before you start down this journey. The first one I'm going to mention here is if you want to push to iOS on the Apple App Store, you need an Apple developer account. And that is going to run you $99 every year. It is a yearly renewal. And if you don't renew, any app that you have in the App Store is going to go dormant, and new people won't be able to download it. So that is going to be a recurring cost. It is fairly expensive. On the Google side of things, if you want to publish to Android, you're going to need a Google Play Console account, and that is $25 for a lifetime membership. Once you pay that $25, that is it. You are good for the lifetime of that account. You don't have to keep paying that. You're also going to need a Google Cloud Services account. We're going to talk about it in a moment, but you'll need to create and download an API key for your credentials to push to the Google Play Store, which is why you need that account. And then you need an expo.dev account if you want to use their EAS CLI, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that's also a free account. So once you have those 4 accounts, there's a few things, a few pieces of documentation that you need to get together and have ready for the app submission process. And the first one that I'm going to mention is a privacy policy. So as a developer, these aren't the things that I'm usually thinking about. I'm thinking about, I just want to develop stuff and put it together and share it with everybody. But when you're dealing with app stores, you have a legal requirement to technically have a privacy policy that you link your store listing to. Fortunately, there are websites out there that make this very easy. I've got a link to one here that it will just ask you a few questions and build a policy for you for free. It just asks you, are you a business? Are you an individual? Where are you located? And then it's like, here's your privacy policy. You can use that. So it sounds intimidating. It's not too bad, but you do need it. Another thing that you're going to need to start getting together are screenshots. So if you think about an App Store listing, there are lots of screenshots that they require, and they have to be in very specific sizes, and you have to launch your app on all kinds of different devices to get those screenshots. Fortunately, there are good Figma templates out there that make this very easy, where you can grab just a few screenshots and then drop them in a Figma template, and it will resize them for you and help you make them look really nice and very professional. So again, I've got links to some of those Figma templates in the guide for this that you can check out later on. Another thing that you need to think about is you're going to have an app icon, whether you design that yourself or have some kind of tool generate an icon for you, or if you have somebody that you know that is creative, get them started working on an icon. You will need an icon at the end of this, so you don't want to get to the end and realize, oh shoot, I never designed an icon, now I have to go do that. So you want to have that as well. And then you're going to need a write-up. So how are you going to convince people to download your application? You want to have some kind of compelling write-up that, again, shows people why they should download your app and not the other one. It goes back to how is your application going to stand out, and thinking through that, what your differentiator is going to be. Another prerequisite on the technical side for a moment is the EAS CLI. And EAS stands for Expo Application Services. And this is the CLI tool that you're going to use to build your binary package that will then be uploaded to the App Store. So after you do your development, you're going to use this CLI to actually build that package and ship it. So you can install it with this quick, easy command here. And then there's also a link to the Expo documentation, which again takes you by the hand and leads you through this process of how you actually get that built, how you sign into your different accounts, and that sort of thing. So now, those are the prerequisites that you need for both platforms. Now we're going to step back and look at just the Android side, and then we're going to go over to the Apple side and look at some of the specific differences between the two. So on the Android side of things, I mentioned that API account earlier that you get from Google Cloud Services. So you'll need to log into that, and you need to create an API key, a JSON API key, and download it and save it somewhere safe, because you're going to plug that into the EAS CLI for the upload process. There is a guide out there that tells you exactly what you need to do in the console to get that. I'm not going to go through all of that here, but the guide is out there. It's easy to follow. It's in the companion guide for this talk as well. There's also some different things that you're going to need to put in your code specific for Android. So when you use that Expo CLI to create your project, you're obviously going to get a package.json file because it's a JavaScript project, but you're also going to get an app.json file. And inside that app.json file, it's going to have two different objects in there, one for Android that we're going to look at now, and another object for iOS that we're going to look at in a little bit. One particular gotcha that kind of got me in this process is when we think about versioning our app. So you have a version and you make some changes and you submit a new build to build a new version. Typically what we do is bump the version in your package.json, and that's usually good enough. But on the Android side, they have this additional version code in the app.json file that you need to make sure you bump that as well. That's tracked separately from the other version in your package.json. Because if you submit the same version code twice, once you get to the upload process, it's going to throw you a weird error and be very unhappy. So you just need to make sure that you bump both of those versions when you're doing the Android stuff. All right, back to the submission process. So to submit your app, you're going to go to the Google Play console. And this is the page where you fill out all of those details that we prepared earlier. So your write-up, you're going to upload all of your photos and all of these different things. Couple things here is you're going to have to select a category for your app. So it will have a little quiz that it guides you through to help you figure out how do you want to categorize this. Is it a game? Is it a lifestyle app? Is it productivity? So just kind of have that in mind when you're on this page of what is it that I'm building and how am I going to categorize it. And then you're also going to have to go through an age rating survey. You'll have to do that on iOS as well, but it will ask you several different questions about the target audience of your app, what kind of content is in it, and at the end it will say your app is rated for this age range. So you need to be ready to go through that. And then you'll have some privacy declaration things of what sort of permissions does your app use? Does it use the camera or location or what have you? So just be ready to walk through those different elements. Then, once you have that store page created, you're ready to actually start building using that EAS CLI that you installed earlier. So it's very simple. It's EAS build, and then you're going to target the Android platform here. and that will go and create an APK build that you can actually install on an Android device. You have your binary ready to go. Now, normally, to submit to the store would just be one further command, which is EAS submit. However, the very first time that you build it, that won't work. You have to go back to the Google Play console, and you have to upload that APK manually yourself, just for the first time. After you do it that one time, then you can use the command line tools to run that build locally, or run that submit locally, rather. All right, the beta. This is probably the worst part of building a mobile app, and it's specific to Android. Android has a particularly tedious process that you have to go through for this. And this process that we're about to talk through is only if you're an individual app developer. If you are a business and you are registering with Google as a business, they have different requirements. But these requirements are you're just yourself, you're building and submitting this app as yourself, not a business. To get to production, you have to go through this closed beta process. And what this involves is it's going to start out with a pre-survey. They're going to ask you different questions about what your app is about, what it does, who's going to download it, how many people do you expect to download it, why do you think people are going to download it. It actually asks some fairly detailed questions about your application and the target audience. After you finish that survey, you need to gather 12 different people that have real Android devices. Those 12 people, which I don't know how many friends you guys have, but it's actually kind of difficult to find 12 people with Android phones sometimes. So you have to be thinking about that. There may or may not be Reddit communities that help you find people if you don't have enough. So you have to get those 12 people. They all have to have your app installed on their phone for 14 days. All of them together at the same time. That's very important because if you get to day 13 and one person uninstalls your app, it resets the whole thing. And you got to go through the whole thing over again. So you need to stress to your testers, leave this on your phone until I tell you it's okay to uninstall it and get through this process. This actually used to be worse. When I went through it last year, it was 20 people, and they've since dropped it down to 12. So it's a very painful process, but it's the rules that they have put forth recently. If you have an old Google Play Console account that's pre-2024, I think, you don't have this requirement. But if you're making a new account, this is what you're going to have to go through. So anyways, after you do all of that, you have a post survey to fill out. That post survey is going to ask you, how did you find people to test? What did they find? How did they submit feedback? What mechanism? Did they call you or text you or email you? What feedback did they find? Did you fix the feedback? So there's all of these questions that they're going to be asking that you need to be ready to answer, and it's kind of a little bit of a pain, if I'm honest. And then once you go through all of that, you're not quite done yet. You have to submit it for a production app review. And this review is going to be submitting it to a Google employee or somebody who's contracted through Google, and they're going to look at your app separately and do their own testing on it that's invisible to you. And that process takes another 7 to 14 days. So, once you're through this whole thing, you're looking at 3 or 4 weeks of closed beta. So just try to be in that mindset of once you get to this stage, it's going to take a little while. This is not the kind of thing where you want to be all excited and get your app out to the world, and then now I've got all of this madness that I have to get through. Just be prepared for it. So that's the Google side of things. I got to pick up my pace a little bit here. So on Apple, it's a little bit different. Apple is a little bit stricter on privacy, and especially like having those declarations spelled out very explicitly. So I mentioned that app.json file earlier and some of the Android things that are in there. On the iOS side, you have to have all of these privacy declarations that you spell out in that file. And you might be thinking, what might I have to put in there? And it can be a little more subtle than what you might initially realize. So if you're saving data to the system, you need this disk space declaration. If you are using a timer or anything of that nature, then you have to have the system boot time declaration. And there's a documentation page on Apple's developer docs that walk you through all of the different types that are out there and why you might need them. So I would definitely recommend looking at that. Let's see. Thought I had another slide in here. I guess not. Okay, so just be mindful of those things, of what you put in your declarations and how you do that. When you're submitting to the Apple Store, you go through the EAS build process just like before. You target iOS this time. You don't have to do the manual upload like you did with Android. You can just submit it right away through the CLI, and it's nice and easy. Now let's talk through the testing flow. This is a little bit different than the Google closed beta. It's a little bit less painful. What this is going to look like is you're going to do your Expo build, your EAS build, and submit. That's going to upload it to TestFlight. TestFlight is an application that Apple puts out there that lets you download a staging / pre-production version of the app, install it in a production-like setting, play with your app there before you try to actually push it to production. After you have decided that it's good to go and you want to submit it, you submit it for an Apple review. So you submit it to an Apple reviewer. You don't have to have a bunch of other people install it. And chances are they're going to reject it the first time. Anytime that I've submitted an app for the first time, they always reject it first time for some reason or another. Sometimes they just need more information. Sometimes you didn't do your permissions right. They're really, really, really picky about those things. So just kind of expect that the first time you go through this, they're going to find some reason to reject it. But the helpful part is they're usually very explicit about what is wrong and what you need to do to correct it. So you'll build it, you'll correct the problem, you'll build it again, you'll push it to TestFlight, it'll go all the way through, and then eventually you get accepted. And after you get accepted, your app is live. Congratulations. You can pat yourself on the back after that. So that is really how you go from idea all the way to production and what you can expect with building a mobile app. So I've got just a couple minutes. I'm going to breeze through this super fast. We're going to talk about burnout really, really quickly. So when you have a project, typically what happens is you have an idea. You get really, really excited about it at first. It's the best thing ever. You can't wait to build it. You're telling all your friends about it. And then you get bogged down. You run into a problem. You can't figure out how to solve it. You're working on it by yourself, so finding help is really hard. And you just run into this wall, and you get discouraged. And then eventually you get distracted. Something else comes up, life happens, you get excited about something else, and then you put it on the shelf, and there it sits. How many of you have finished every project that you've started? Yeah, nobody has, right? So I think we've all faced this in some way. So what can you do about it? Make sure to balance your time. Don't put all of your time into one thing. Try and spread it out a little bit, because you're going to burn yourself out if this is all you think and breathe for a few weeks and then you end up getting sick of it. Remember, it's going to take time. That closed beta process, getting all this documentation together, it's going to take a little bit of time. It's a new technology. New technology is you always run into roadblocks sometimes, right? So be expecting these things. Plan to get stuck. Just be ready for it. Try not to compare yourself to others. There's always somebody that's going to be building faster and better than you are. So just remember to pace yourself. It's not a race. And then involve others. If you tell people about what you're doing and get them excited, they're going to reciprocate and get you excited about your own project as well. And They might also give you good feedback. You might tell them, I'm going to build an app that does this, and they'll tell you, well, maybe you should do this other thing instead, or people might like this other feature for it to work this way. The more opinions you can get, the better your product will be in the end. So I've got to have a corny quote at the end to make the presentation complete, but the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So you'll never finish it if you never start it. So hopefully this has inspired you to get started with your own project soon. And we are right at 45, so I got to let you go. I will take questions at the end. I'll be standing down here, but I'll let you get to your movie for now, and I'll leave this up for just a second. So I appreciate it. Thank you.